All right, so we're almost there. There's just one last thing we have to do before we worry about minifying and stuff like that, and that is Autoprefixer. So if you're a regular front end or CSS developer, you probably already heard of this. If not, basically what Autoprefixer does is it will prefix your CSS values that need it. And it's really great, especially if you do need to support older browsers. And even if not, it just lets you focus on writing CSS like a normal human being and not having to worry about silly things like vendor prefixes. So this is a little bit more complicated to set up. Not too bad, but first thing, as always, in our package.json, we need to install two more things. We need the postcss-loader. Postcss-loader is really great because basically what it is it's just a housing for a bunch of CSS plugins. If you're not familiar with what it can do, definitely check it out. If you're using not ESLint, StyleLint, I believe this is where you would also incorporate it with. I'm using WebStorm, so I just use the built-in IDE version, but I can definitely see it being on a bigger team more helpful to just have it in the Webpack build. So yeah, there is that. So we need the post CSS loader, and then the plugin we're going to use inside the CSS loader is Autoprefixer. So basically, as I said, Autoprefixer will just add vendor prefixes to CSS properties that need it. There is one other thing we have to do while we're in this file. We need to create this property called browsers list. And this is actually pretty helpful. Basically what it does is it tells all your tools, your node tools, what browsers you support. And browser list is like its own spec and API, so you can check that out to see all the list of options you can pass through. But basically you list what browsers you support, and all your tools that use this will reference this and respond accordingly. So in other words, right here, what I'm saying is I'm only supporting browsers that more than 1% of people use, and that I'm supporting Internet Explorer greater than 9. Okay, so Autoprefixer will look at that and figure out which vendor prefixes it should attach to your properties according to those browsers. And side note, this is, at least it was relatively new to me. The new Babel env preset is also kind of the same, philosophy where it is, instead of just always compiling ES6 right down to ES5, it's instead now, since ES6 is actually pretty well supported now, it's going to look at your browsers list and determine what needs to actually be transformed and what doesn't. Right, so very helpful. So there's that. Now let's go to the config. Okay, so nothing too crazy here actually. In our loader that we built for our CSS, all we have to do is now add the post CSS loader, which we just installed to our chain here. And important thing to note is that this should go after your pre-processing, because the post CSS loader deals with CSS, not Sass and stuff. So definitely want to do that after, and definitely before CSS as well. So just put it in the middle of the chain there. And then what we need to do is, let me just check my references here. Okay, yes. So then post CSS needs a config itself, because remember, post CSS is just a housing for other plugins. And we are using Autoprefixer, so we have to tell post CSS that we want it to use Autoprefixer, basically. You can check the post CSS docs, because you can just put your config in your Webpack config, which you may or may not want to do. In this case, I decided not to, but it's definitely just as easy to put it inside. Basically, what they suggest is to make your own post css.config.js file in the Ruby project here. And this will basically just set it up. So you just write this module exports a object. You can pass other stuff in here too. It's all a bunch of settings for post-CSS. But basically all we need for this instance is to tell it to use a plugin called Autoprefixer, and we're just requiring it in as a node module here. And that's pretty much it. So once you get that set up, let me reopen that package.json, and I'm going to start the build. And again, this is probably something that you'll want to add to your production tool chain, not necessarily your dev tool chain, because you're probably just going to be focused on writing your CSS, and you're probably working in one browser. Now, in the case that if you're the kind of developer and that you have to test things out on, different browsers and stuff, then maybe you do want to add this to your development chain, so that way you can see what stuff looks like. But again, if you're testing against your distribution build, which you probably should, then this is probably fine to just leave in your production chain. Cool. So this is built here. And as you can see now, if I go to my sources, why am I getting interesting? Okay. Okay, as you can see in my sources now, I can see that I've made in the home, I've made this class called Flex with a display of Flex. And you see, because I support browsers that are being used by more than 1% of people, but I'm also supporting Internet Explorer greater than 9, you see Autoprefixer is smart enough to know and say, okay, that means I have to do display WebKit-box for older Safari, and I have to do display MS Flexbox for Internet Explorer 10, right? And similarly on the common styles, it's gone through and it's added a WebKit prefixed version of my linear gradient background. Great. So really awesome. You don't have to think about that stuff. It's pretty annoying. And just to show that this is working great, I'm going to up this to, I only support more than 10% of browsers, and I'm going to get rid of IE9 because everyone hates IE9 anyways. Or IE in general, but I didn't say that. Okay, build is done. So you see, because I'm not supporting the less than 10%, I guess apparently that's what older Safari and WebKit browsers fall under. So I only need the regular linear gradient, no prefixing. And if you go back into home, you see I just need regular Flex. I don't need any special vendor prefixes. So that's pretty much it. Again, there's so much more you can do with post-CSS, so definitely check that out. And you can toy around with the browser list API too to see which browsers you support, and then adjust accordingly, and your build tools will all figure stuff out for you. It's pretty great. So yeah, the last thing we're going to do is minify this stuff, but you can see we've already got it's somewhat complex tool chain. What we're getting a lot of power out here, right? Aside from all the setting up, which you only have to do once, right? Now we can just come into our JS, require in some styles we wrote specifically contained to this piece of our application, and Webpack is smart enough to separate them out and add these prefixes and compile them and all that stuff. So a lot of power here. Cool.